shelf life, passers-by just can't help staring at me. My bargain basement's all sold out, but while stocks last, I keep myself back for you. It's not what you know, it's who you know. This summer's price is the best one yet. Last winter I was the new range in, but fashion's changed to rearrange my space, and I'll bring home the bacon for you. It's not what you know, it's who you know.
Hello, this is episode number 43 or some other number of the For All That podcast, and we're joined by a couple of returning guests. First today we've got Ivan McKee from Business for Scotland. It's the second time on the podcast. How's it going, Ivan?
I'm good.
Yep.
Everything's going well.
We're also joined by Ruaridh Waddell, who's our international jet-setting companion for today, who's an aid worker in Zambia but is currently in New York. How's it going, Ruaridh?
Yeah, good, thanks, Michael. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. As always, I'm joined by Andrew Tickell. How's it going?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. How's yourself?
Yeah, not too bad. So, for our first topic, I think it'd probably be best to start with Ivan, because I've not got the biggest head for business, and I'm not sure about Andrew or Rory there, but we're going to ask about the CBI and the related goings on. Ivan, have you had any thoughts on that?
Well, it's been a bit of a saga. Obviously, of course, the CBI took what I thought was a very bizarre decision to register with the Electoral Commission. I didn't see why, from a purely political point of view, it made any sense for them to do that, because up to that point they'd been able to portray themselves, obviously incorrectly, but they'd got away with it for years, portray themselves as being an impartial voice representing business, and by and large people had kind of bought that message, apart from those of us who knew a bit more about how they were actually configured and how they operated. But what they did, they kind of blew their cover by deciding to register for the No campaign. And what that exposed was a number of things. It exposed the fact that the Scottish CBI was controlled from London, exposed the fact that their membership list was very, very weak, to say the least, and it exposed the fact that they hadn't had any consultation with their members before making that decision. So all that was bad enough. But then they decided to try and deregister themselves, which actually compounded the felony. So now they've outed themselves as a no-friendly organisation, but they've also outed themselves as a fairly incompetent and under-represented organisation with a dodgy record in consulting their members. So the next time, of course, they're on the media, they'll get challenged for not being impartial, and they'll need to. And then, of course, the bigger problem, of course, is the BBC, who have now, we'll discover, have been a member of the CBI for decades, bizarrely, paid the CBI a lot of money over that time for membership fees, and it puts them in a very uncomfortable position as well. So all in all, it's a bit of a big mess.
Yeah, I mean, as all our listeners know, I'm usually a major fan of large business organisations that are from London. But the BBC is an interesting part on it for me, because I did a little piece this week talking about the BBC. Sometimes it's not necessarily that they're coming out with bias, but they do have a strange idea about what's impartiality. There was a famous story with a journalist called George Alagaya, who was quite high up in the Fair Trade Association. And they made him withdraw from that if he wanted to continue to be on the television, because they said it was a conflict of interest and that he couldn't do both. It was an organisation that was too involved. However, they have Evan Davis, who's involved in several neoliberal think tanks, and that one's not ideologically charged, but the Fair Trade Foundation, which most people kind of think's quite a good idea, I don't know, but that one's too political. I think it's quite a strange take on it, but I don't know, Ruaridh, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I just think it was an interesting decision, given the effect that it would have on a great swathe of their membership, that institutions like universities and the BBC and other media organizations would be kind of forced into a corner. And yeah, like Ivan said, I can't really understand the decision-making process that went behind that. I mean, I don't know how many, after the dust has settled, how many members do they actually have left in Scotland now? I don't know if you have any idea, Ivan.
Yeah, the number that we are working on. I mean, they don't publish any membership data, but it is possible. People have done some work on it, going through the register and identifying on the basis that if you were paying money to be in the register, anybody that was a member would be there because they get it for free. I think that's how it works. So we assume that anybody that's in the register is a member. There may even be some on that register that aren't members, but we take that number as being the maximum number. I believe it was coming in about 91, and I think at the last count there have been 18 or so resignations as a consequence of this. As you say, most of those being universities or government agencies, etc. But obviously some businesses as well, if you like.
It's also worth pointing out a development on this story which happened with the Electoral Commission, that the CBI wanted to deregister, having accidentally registered with the Electoral Commission as a result of some junior employee that we're told. They've managed to get away with that. That's an interesting point. They've managed, because they said that the wrong person had signed their forms, they're no longer a permitted participant under the Act, and so they're no longer able, one, to spend 150,000 quid, but secondly, they're no longer affiliated with the No campaign. But I think Ivan is right to a significant extent. I think with the CBI here, what we see is what I like to think of as a Cardinal Keith O'Brien effect. Remember, the Catholic Church was very dominant. And expand. I should define that and be careful to do so. But the Catholic Church was very active in the campaign against equal marriage for a long period of time. They were occupying the sofas in terms of public interviews, public affairs programs like Scotland Tonight, whatever. They were really dominating that and being constructed as a legitimate and interesting participant in that debate. Cardinal Keith O'Brien has his wee scandal, and boom, they're jiggered. And I think the same is true about the CBI. The CBI now will have lost that patina of, we're just objective business persons here giving reasonable warnings. They've lost that. And that is certainly, I think, a loss for the Better Together campaign, that they will no longer be approached as simply individuals who are issuing an opinion using their lore and their know-how, and I think that's a big loss for the Better Together campaign here.
Ivan, just wanted to come to you with something. Are there any organisations, kind of business umbrella organisations, that you would consider to be neutral or not ideologically charged in this debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Chambers of Commerce obviously do what they do, and they're a fairly diverse organisation with lots of local groups and local members. And we've certainly done some debates with local Chambers of Commerce, and they've had both sides along. So I would say that they've not, to my knowledge, definitely taken a definitive position as such. I mean, some of obviously people involved will have views. So yes, I think that's you could maybe look at them as being in that position to some extent.
Can I ask you a question, Ivan? One of the points which has come up in the discussion around this funding debate around the referendum is about a common plan, which is the idea that if you're a permitted participant and you engage in a common plan with a designated organisation, legally we're talking about Better Together there, we're talking about Yes Scotland, if you engage in a common plan and campaign together, that has implications for your spending totals. I wondered if you're in a position to talk to us a wee bit about what Business for Scotland is doing to try and avoid some of the difficulties which might meet that. One of the consequences of having a common plan is that, generally speaking, the cost of that's reduced from Yes Scotland's overall total. So they're allowed to spend £1.5 million in this campaign during the period of 16 weeks before the poll. But if you work together, that has implications. I wonder, could you talk to us about that at all?
Andrew, I was going to ask you that question. Some free legal advice. It's what can I say? We're certainly well aware of it. We are going through the process at the moment of trying to fully understand it. I think it's fair to say that there may be grey areas there which could be interesting. But we, as a board, are very keen to ensure that we are compliant. So we are taking advice to make sure there's nothing we're doing once we get into the regulated period that would cause a problem or the perception of a problem there. But as I said, I'd love to get some free advice from you later on that.
Well, I could give you at least one or two for our listeners as well, flag up one or two of the issues around this.
Please do.
About this question, well, what does it mean to be in a common plan? For example, if you have a Yes Scotland sticker with a characteristic font and the style on your flyers, say, or for an event, is that a common plan? Even if you don't talk to Yes Scotland about it, it isn't terribly clear, and that's going to be a big problem. Under the legislation, the Electoral Commission is obliged to provide guidance to participants on what constitutes a common plan. Now, for the Better Together campaign, which is not particularly grassroots, which is all really under the umbrella of Better Together, it would seem, in all fairness, it's not likely to be such a problem. But for Yes Scotland, with all of these organisations like Business for Scotland, like National Collective, there is that problem. If Yes Scotland advertises on its website a Women for Independence event, is that a common plan? Bending towards the goal of independence? I think it's likely to be a very tricky one, and I really do sympathise with folk like yourself, Ivan, and for our comrades and other aspects of the independence movement, because this is going to be a bugger to try and get right.
Where do podcasts fit into it?
I don't know. Are we in a common plan? Is this planned? I thought this was kind of a happy ramshackle sort of enterprise we're engaged in here, Mike.
And we like it that way.
And we don't spend any money on it, happily. And we're an open-minded forum for discussion, so we're not campaigning one way or the other, are we? Despite our rancid nationalist tendencies.
Ruaridh, any thoughts there?
No, I was just about to ask the same question as you, as to where does things like the podcast and your smaller grassroots events fit into that. But it's a bit difficult, because at the end of the day, we're all campaigning for a common plan, and that's independence for Scotland. So it's a tricky one.
Well, I've just had in the latest edict from Cybernet Control, and they've told me that you'll all find this week's orders in the envelope behind the pipes in all pubs with Gaelic names. So and I suppose that could move us on to our second topic, because the recent people who've had orders from Cybernet Control is the Sunday Herald. And it appears that totalitarian tyrant Salmond has had a word with someone, and the Sunday Herald has changed allegiance. Or has it changed allegiance? Did it go from neutral to yes, or did it go from no to yes? But what do you think, Ruaridh? Do you think this is as big a thing as people are making it out to be?
I don't think it's as big a thing as people are making it out to be, but nevertheless, I think it's still a big mark in the campaign that you actually have a media title from the mainstream coming out for yes. I mean, I remember when the campaigns were launched, the Sunday Herald said they would take a position, but I imagined, I'm not surprised that they came out for yes, but I imagined it would be much later on in the campaign. I think it's a fantastic thing, but I don't think it's a huge game changer. If you look at the circulation figures for the Herald, it's not. It's 21,000 is their average circulation. So while obviously we welcome it, I don't think it's that big tipping point moment that some people are painting it to be.
Well, they sold out everything on Sunday, but I don't know, Andrew, what was your thoughts on it?
Well, I think there was an interesting point. I mean, I wrote a wee blog about this and wondered about some of the enthusiasm about where it was coming from. Because, as Ruaridh was saying, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense just instrumentally, because not all that many people read the Sunday Herald. And maybe there's one explanation for that. The fact is that I think people tend to overestimate the circulation of the mainstream media in this country. It's always a bit of a shock when you discover how relatively limited, for example, the Scotsman circulation is, or the Herald. For those that read it within the echo chamber, and everyone reading it, it can seem very significant, but actually when you get the kind of cold hard figures, it rather changes your perspective on it. I think, my own thoughts are set down in the blog post I wrote about it earlier on in the week about some of what this might tell us about some of the nationalist psychology, but it is a good thing, because it does say to people, this is actually a credible offering, which a respected news organ which you read and take an interest in is willing to endorse. And I'm sure the folk that read it, I wouldn't dream of patronising them and think that they take their line from the Sunday Herald. I'm sure they don't. But it does nudge for a particular section of the West Coast Scotland bourgeoisie an idea that independence is something which is at the very least worth taking a serious look at. And that's a good thing in a campaign where we still have a big gap in terms of particularly how the kind of middle classes in Scotland intend to vote in this referendum.
Yeah, and sorry, just to say one thing, I did actually think the editorial that accompanied the declaration, so to speak, was actually a very well written and very fair and I thought very balanced view of why the paper was taking that stance. I also think their editorial staff at a higher level should also be given credit for allowing the editors of the different papers to make their own decisions on which horse they're going to back. So, hats off to the editorial team.
It's also maybe worth saying, sorry, Michael, just to be a brute and to leap in briefly, that what's really interesting about the way the editorial was framed was it was suffused with the idea that independence is not a question of identity, but a question about powers and governance and democracy. So it really reflected that, the mainstreaming of that case for independence, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
Ivan, what did you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, just putting my business head here on, you got to remember that these guys are in the business of selling newspapers. So I think if you look at the whole group, the Herald group having a number of titles, it may, to some extent, from a commercial point of view, be them. Okay, let's put a toe in the water here and see what the size of this pro-yes market really is. So it'll be interesting to see their circulation numbers. Clearly, last week was a special one. I think this week they're putting in some kind of poster thing as well. So that might be a bit of a special one as well. But it'll be interesting to see after 3 or 4 weeks how the circulation settles down on a Sunday, and I think they'll be watching that closely. So that could be interesting in terms of what it says for the other titles going forward. In terms of the impact of it on the campaign, obviously it's good news. In reality, I suppose it was if you're going to pick a paper to come out, obviously that was the one, and we've known that for a long time. It's fairly early in the campaign, which is good. You're right, the readership isn't huge, but then again, the readership of the Daily Herald or the Scotsman isn't any bigger. So it's on a par with those, and either of those coming out one way or the other would be relatively significant as well, just from an impact point of view. So I don't think we've won the campaign in the back of it, but I think it's just another building block, of which there are a few, which is going to help towards the yes vote as we go forward.
I say this in the full hope of being proved wrong, but on the day that the Scotsman decides to support independence, Satan will be skating to work.
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about the Mephistophelian here, then there's another big media outlet which is of interest, and I know there's lots of gossip doing the rounds about it, and it's the Scottish Sun. What will Uncle Rupert do about independence? And I've certainly encountered a number of people who are much better informed than I am, who have at least gestured towards the idea that there are ongoing discussions across the kind of Scottish media firmament about, well, what will the Scottish Sun do? And there's a small chance that it might determine to endorse independence. Somebody suggested to me, potentially speculatively, but I give it to you simply for its own interest's sake, that Uncle Rupert's frustration at the Levisonian processes of the British state might decide that he's had enough of David Cameron, and he's going to have a bit of fun in his advanced old age by screwing him over and endorsing independence and reviving all that fun that the Scottish Sun had way back when we were talking about the 2011 election and making fun of Ian Gray. There's an outside possibility this might happen, and for those of us that are not regular readers of the Scottish Sun, that might not be a thing which moves you. But again, the Sun, the tabloids, have a much bigger circulation here, and that might be kind of interesting too. I don't know how you'd feel about that, Michael, if that happened.
If someone I don't like, because I'm not a major fan of Rupert Murdoch, you might have picked that up.
That's why I asked.
Comes out in favour of something that I do like, it doesn't mean that I have to stop liking it. I'm sure Rupert Murdoch possibly likes chocolate. I like chocolate as well. It doesn't mean that I have to stop eating chocolate because Rupert...
Good God, you fiend.
Yeah. I don't take political education from Murdoch papers anyway, and I'm sure my reasons for supporting independence would be vastly different from his. However, I think that shows that one of the strengths of the Yes campaign is that there's so many good reasons. Now, there's a good positive answer for you.
I remember a few years ago when the referendum was first announced, he was quizzed on it, and he said that the idea of Scottish independence was one that appealed to him, but he remained to be convinced. And I think it would have been in 2011 or 2012.
Did anyone else really like the cover?
Of the Sunday Herald.
Yeah.
Yes, it was beautiful.
I don't know. The lions with bagpipes. I suppose I'm not wildly convinced by that, but I like the thistle was sort of rather dramatic.
Yeah.
So something else that might be considered a positive note, although Better Together were trying to spin it as a negative, was pensions. The Department of Work and Pensions has said clearly that pensions will be guaranteed in an independent Scotland, which is not the story that Better Together campaign have been trying to tell. I think I'll maybe go to Ivan first there. What did you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, the pensions is one of these things that of the Better Together playbook of scare stories, it's one that they're majoring on because the demographic that obviously affects is a demographic that's more inclined, according to the polls, to vote no for whatever reasons. And they're trying to build that up as a scare story that will affect the way people perceive independence. And I mean, you got to say they've had kind of some the anecdotal feedback you get is they've had some kind of success on that. So it's work we've got to do to reassure people that that's not an issue. The reality, of course, is that as far as state pensions are concerned, an independent Scotland would be better placed economically to support them than the rest of the UK would. And of course, the way the system works at the moment, of course, is that if you pay in the national insurance over the years, you're entitled to a UK pension, no matter where you go to live. So if you retire to France or Spain, as many people do, you continue to collect your UK pension. So Steve Webb, the pensions minister, clarified that last week. So really, when you actually look at the facts here, Better Together don't really have a leg to stand on, and that was another part of that scare story debunked last week.
Ruaridh, it's unheard of that a Better Together scare story should be debunked in such a way. I mean, it's literally never happened before. But
yeah, it was the snapping of another arrow in the quiver of Better Together scare stories.
It's a very elegant metaphor.
I thought you'd like that one, Andrew.
Yeah.
I mean, are we really going to believe that Scottish pensioners are going to be any different from British or pensioners living in Australia or Canada? You know, are we going to be denied the same rights? I mean, next, please.
Okay.
It's you told Michael.
No, but it's very interesting.
No, I mean, next scare story, please. I mean, seriously, you know.
No, but it's interesting because, I mean, they try to scare about the pensions being lost, but the British pension's already one of the lowest in Europe. It's very, very poor. I mean, it could be something that Yes should be campaigning on. You know, the pensions will be higher in an independent Scotland because in the United Kingdom, compared to other countries in Europe, they're pitifully low.
No, I've been too young, of course, myself, Michael, to even think. I mean, I'm of the generation that assumes that I'm going to have to die in a gutter in my 50s in order to have a sort of enjoyable life. And I might as well, sort of puke out my existence as cheerfully as possible now, because in the long run, I'm doomed. So that's my chipper, optimistic view on pensions. I must admit, as a man in my 20s, I have probably given it rather less thought than I ought to. On the other hand, though, Ivan is correct that one of the demographics that's particularly opposed to independence, or not yet convinced, if we're feeling a bit more chipper about it, are the old folks, and this is a kind of story which we're getting from Gordon Brown, which is calculated to if people are already susceptible and already feeling skeptical about the whole kit and caboodle, then the idea that you would lose or at least have uncertainty around the very thing that sustains your existence is a very effective political strategy, and it's not a surprise to see Better Together going for that. What is more of a surprise, as you say, what transpired in the House of Commons committee.
Okay, so thank you for that elegant transition, Andrew. And someone else who seems to have made this story passed me by, but Ruaridh mentioned it just before we started, is that someone else made an elegant transition from the Labour Party to Labour for Indy and supporting independence. Ruaridh, would you like to tell us a bit about that story?
Just as I was waiting for everybody to join the podcast, I was going through Twitter and noticed that I think it's Craig Wilson. I think he's the secretary of the Edinburgh East Labour constituency and was involved in their Better Together campaign, and he has made the conversion on the road to Damascus and has defected to Labour for Indy.
Labour for Indy is a group that tends to get the if you like, normal Labour, although I hesitate to use the word normal, but it tends to get them quite riled up.
I can sort of understand, though, on some level, why the people that stay in the Labour Party feel a wee bit suspicious about Labour for Independence, because many of these folk are folk that have been historically Labour voters, but which have voted for the SNP for a long period of time. There are others, obviously, that argue for independence within the Labour Party, but it is a slightly ambivalent organisation, as far as I can see, in terms of where the allegiance of its current members lie, and I'm sure many of them are still members of the Labour Party. But if you were a kind of hardcore Labour member still, and you hadn't left and hadn't joined the SNP, then you'd be probably quite unusual. What was interesting about this story was that this was a guy who was active, apparently, in the Edinburgh Better Together campaign, and he said that he had met those that he was having dealings with from presumably the other Better Together coalition parties, the Tories and the Lib Dems, and just found that he didn't have common ground with them, and that increasingly pitched him towards a yes position, which is bizarre, really, that you have an activist who's out there campaigning and planning and plotting to save the union and thinks, actually, God, this isn't worth the candle. So I don't know really seriously how many Labour folk you're likely to see, serious, prominent Labour folk in the near future coming out in favour of a yes vote. I think what's more interesting, perhaps, is the quiet Labour-inclined voters who may well vote yes. I was talking to somebody recently who was saying that they were out champing on the doors in the context of a political campaign, and they said, for a SNP candidate, no, we're not voting for you, but we're not decided about independence just yet. We're not really sure if the Labour Party in Westminster is really serving our goals. We're not really sure if independence would be a better way of kind of achieving the sort of society I want to see. So I think the quiet Labour voter is more interesting, perhaps, than the occasional rather eccentric one that does something quite so reverse ferrety as this.
Ivan, with Business for Indy, you must have had groups that, they were sort of pro-union, but then they've moved into your organisation, or do you know of any businesses that have kind of made that jump? This person was in the political sense, but, that have done that economically. They've kind of, I hesitate to say seen the light, but, do you know of any businesses that have made that same journey?
Oh, yeah, in terms of individuals, there's countless examples. We've got a great guy called Richard Arkless, who's doing a power of work for us. He lives down in Stranraer, and he's doing a lot of work for us down in that part of the country at public meetings, etc. And he tells a story about he was pro-union until he started to look at the economic case not that long ago, and that convinced.
I think the one interesting thing to add to this, though, is when you actually read what he says, and he really lets slip the facade that the Better Together campaign, likes to portray as it being very much a coalition, and he talks very strongly about how that's not the case, and it really is a Tory front. I'd encourage you to, if you have 5 minutes today, to go and have a read about what he says.
Yeah, I'll stick the link in the podcast notes. Andrew, sorry.
But there's an interesting thing, though, about who works in Better Together. Who are they? What kind of folk are they? And it's not true, actually, that the folk that work in Better Together are a Tory front. They're generally a kind of Blairite Labour lot. Their main organiser is a guy that ran David Miliband's campaign for leadership. And actually, there's a strong Blairite-tinged Labour quality in the staff in Better Together. There's I think one Tory. There's a designated Tory in the permanent staff. But they are primarily Labour. But I think, as I've maybe said on this podcast a number of times before, this is only going to get worse. We've already seen the various parties involved in Better Together chewing away at each other and getting very antsy and anxious in the face of this campaign, and that's only going to get worse because their partisan interest is guided entirely in the other direction by the focus on the general election campaign, and that's going to get worse, which is something which can only be probably, I think, a good thing for the pro-independence folks.
Yeah, absolutely. When they're knocking lumps out of each other and then have to kind of turn around and work together on another issue, it doesn't seem, or it won't seem, particularly convincing.
No, you can put it even very, very simply. Better Together doesn't agree internally about why we're better together. how are they going to persuade the rest of us of this fact if they can't even agree between themselves? That's a challenge.
Ivan.
Yeah, I'm here, and I think that 2 points on that whole political thing. Well, 3 actually. First of all, I think when the European elections are complete, which is now only less than a couple of weeks away, then effectively party politics is over, in the run-in to the referendum. And I think what Andrew was saying about your traditional Labour voter, they'll have done their last bit of Labour voting for the year, and then they'll start to think about the referendum, and hopefully a lot of people will then free themselves of their party political loyalties, and look at the referendum on its merits or otherwise. So I think that's 1 point. Secondly, I think that the fact that the referendum is when it is no accident, with the general election coming up not that far behind it. And I think Labour is going to find it much, much more difficult than the Tories will, because frankly the Tories obviously don't really care about Scotland. So they've got a Westminster strategy which they will execute, and they only need to face in one direction. The Labour, on the other hand, has to be facing in 2 directions at the same time, fighting on 2 fronts, and they're going to find it increasingly difficult, I think, to manage to pull that trick off.
No, I think that's probably true. I don't know if it is true though that the Tories don't really care about Scotland. I think they've got a fairly ambivalent attitude towards the country, given all the discussion which is going on at the minute around the idea that David Cameron would resign if we vote yes, which, as some people pointed out, would be a brilliant thing for progressive forces in England, because it would throw the Tory party into absolute disarray months in front of the general election. I think what's really interesting is how little attention the general election has got seen through the lens of the independence referendum. Just think about it. If we get a Labour majority elected on Scottish votes across the UK, and those Scottish votes, Scottish MPs, disappear after independence, then that will pitch a majority or a minority Labour government into an even smaller minority. There's a possibility for all of these chimerical sort of outcomes if you add in or subtract Scottish Labour MPs. And we're seeing some signs in the UK press of waking up to this, just as we see signs of waking up to the possibility of independence. But actually, I think there's a very serious difficulty which will await the Westminster Parliament if we get a yes vote and we have the general election and it produces an ambivalent sort of result. And actually, unfortunately, that's a problem which all of us will have, because all of us, if we get an independent Scotland in September, will want to be negotiating with this disordered, dysfunctional and increasingly disorganised and lost political system in Westminster. Is that an advantage for an independent Scotland, trying to press its hand and press its advantages? I'm not sure, but it's certainly something which might happen, and there's not an awful lot of sign of planning around it yet, as far as I can see.
I wonder if there's planning in secret, officially there's not, but I do wonder if there's all sorts of contingency plans being made.
Well, like what? I mean, you could. Unfortunately, there's a marvelous thing which has happened, which is around the Fixed Term Parliament Act in Westminster. So now the Prime Minister cannot dissolve Parliament using the royal prerogative whenever he or she wishes. They can't just go to the palace and ask Queenie to give the parliamentarians the heave-ho. Now we've got a specific date for the general election written into statute, and the Prime Minister can only vary that by a couple of months. So if they want to not have the general election in Britain say that we get a yes vote and that happens, they're going to have to pass a whole new Act of Parliament to do that. That takes a period of time. It could be done quite quickly, but I don't really see signs, actually, Michael, that they really are seriously planning. And God love him, our beloved Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Carmichael, has said that they are not engaging in any contingency planning, which I don't know, you could regard as a sign of confidence or a sign of being totally off your fucking napper.
And Rudy, now that I can put in the parental advisory sticker for the episode, do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, the other thing I was going to ask was talking about progressive forces in England. Being over here, I didn't hear how Nigel was greeted on his second visit to Scotland ahead of the European elections.
I believe it was much the same as the last time.
But not so much in a pub, and with rather more polite looking signs held up about please go, please don't be a reactionary. We'd really appreciate it. That kind of damning rousing motto.
It's like the guy I saw with the protest signs. On balance, I'm against this thing.
See, that's the only, being such a switherer by disposition, that's about the only protest sign I could hold up with any degree of confidence or sincerity.
Down with this sort of thing, for Father Ted.
Careful now.
Yeah. Okay. And I think that's a good point to wrap up for this week. And thanks to our guests for coming on. Thanks again, Ivan.
Yeah, before I go, I've just got a plug in. There's a guy called Mark Coburn who, as we speak, is cycling all the way from Rome back to Glasgow with his kit's all bedecked out in Yes and Business for Scotland, and he's doing it to raise money for the Yes campaign. You can find him on Twitter, Indy Cyclist. So I would encourage anyone to go and have a look at what he's up to and donate to his fundraiser.
Okay, I'll stick a link to that on the site. And
thank you. Thanks
again for coming on, Ruaridh.
Very, very welcome. Good to speak to you all.
International jet setter that you are.
But it's not all it's painted out to be, believe me.
And Andrew, I'll speak to you soon.
See you anon. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheerio.
This is a calypso about the general election in Great Britain. Me, Lord Beginner, make this calypso in the style of the old minor calypso, which we sing in Trinidad since many years. So hit it out, Mr. Blake. General election we had in Great Britain caused a sensation, independent, also liberal. It was essential, socialist was glad, communist was sad, conservative did cheer at the results in Trafalgar Square. But I was confused, waiting to get the news. Me and Dorothy in the rain and the cold by Piccadilly. 2 long days there was announced in the parties,